Great. So the good thing about having a Swiss professor chairing a session is that, we abide by Swiss time. So it's actually 10:40. And we resume our first session on European experiences with a second paper that will be presented by Tapio Lappi-Seppälä, who's an emeritus professor of criminal law and criminology at the University of Helsinki in Finland, and who used to be director at the same university of the Institute of Criminology and Legal Policy. So Tapio's conducted very wide research on a very wide range of topics, which I cannot all cover here. But there is something that really comes out of his huge publication list and research list. It's both a very strong focus on comparison and comparative penal policy and sentencing, and secondly, a trend or a focus on the history or the comparative history of crime and punishment. So it's a very interesting combination of history and comparison, which makes him a fantastic second speaker for us. So you have the floor, Tapio, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman, for these kind words. The title is about managing and reducing prison population, Finnish and Nordic experiences, because what has happened in Finland has a strong historical roots with also being a part of the Nordic countries. Finland and Sweden used to be together for several hundred years, and then we were an autonomous part of Russia a long time ago and got independence early 1917, in fact. So the issue why Finland is an interesting part of criminal political analysis is that we had a very harsh history in the last century, first half of last century, with several social political crises, civil war, three wars in the shift of the 30s and 40s. And this all created a criminal legislation and a climate and penal practices that raised our incarceration rates well above the other Nordic countries, to a level of 200 prisoners per 100,000 inhabitants, which is a normal way of measuring imprisonment counted relative to population. So from there on started a decrease. Driven by social, economic and political forces and by law reforms and legal experts. And it's a various combination. I will go to some of those ingredients later on. What makes this interesting, this change, is that it took place at the same time when the rest of the world, in many respects, was moving towards another direction. And here you see some examples of prisoner populations from 1960. In the United States, this is the well-known increase of prison population in the United States. Then you see a huge drop here, and then the red area is COVID-19 affected area, and then you see again a upward trend after the COVID drop. The COVID drop can be visible in all countries. Here is England and Wales, the same period of time, now different scale, because US is here 700 per 100,000 inhabitants. England and Wales is, when it was in the peak, it was 160, starting from the level of 60. And then comes Finland at the same period of time. You see totally reverse trend. It starts from where England and Wales ended, and it ends from where England and Wales started. So quite the opposite. And I added France here for the sake of comparison. What happened in France during the same years? It's much more modest compared to England and Wales, but still the trend is clear. quite the opposite as Finland during those days. I have some other graphs here also when we look in more detail for a period to see different trends. Now you see more clearly also the position of France in the area where there is France, Belgium, Netherlands, and for Netherlands you have to have two curves because of a different classification, but you still see, yes, there is an increasing trend in France in that comparison. I just also make a direct comparison with Finland and France, just to make the point clear. And then some indicators between Finland and France. Prisoners now, the latest data, 2022. Finland stock cross-cut the daily population 50, France 106. Flow, how many coming in? Finland 77, France 117. Prison term in months counted differently in both. All respect shows longer prison terms in France. And then community sanctions, which is often overlooked, the community supervision. Now, relative to population, Finland 61, France 284, and also the flow numbers. So whether it is imprisonment in numbers, sitting inside, coming inside, or community sanctions in supervision or entering supervision, the figures in France are much higher. So, and this is also when we look at European comparison, France would be in the middle, but above there would be mainly Eastern European countries and England and Wales. So, what made this change? How Finland changed the policies from the 60s? It's a complicated question because all these kind of changes have several factors influencing. Macro level, meso level, micro level, we can classify these different ways. I think it's useful now for analysis, make a difference between those factors that initiated the change, which are, you could say, they are the drivers of the change, which kicked the movement forward. And then there are factors that sustain and uphold the policy line, which make it, we could call them enablers, which make it possible to conduct a certain policy line, because these factors and situations, they change over time. But there are certain historical moments and historical factors which are the cause of the change, and then there are other factors which make it possible to maintain the line. We will see that. And then there are technical means that how this was technically achieved, by which type of law reforms, etc. I try to now illustrate the main points of these. If we look at the drivers behind the reform movement, we must look at the conditions, socio-economic, political conditions, and cultural conditions of the 60s, which in Finland, the major issue is fast economic growth. Finland was, after the Second World War, joining the Nordic welfare state in resources and in values. The Nordic welfare state became a social model in Finland. There was strong political and social activism, grassroots movements in all Nordic countries, different names, Krim, Krom, and Krum, in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, and Krimi in Finland, who were fighting for reforming the prison system, improving the conditions in enforcement. But not only prisons, all social marginalized groups and minority groups were a target of these grassroots movements. It was a kind of general solidarity project on the 60s. Prisons was one part of that bigger project. For Finland, there was intensified Nordic cooperation in legal, political, cultural matters. There was establishment of a Nordic Council, establishment of the Nordic Research Council of Criminology. There was a Helsinki Treaty agreement with the Nordic nations to harmonize a central part of the legislation. So this was far before the European Union harmonization, and in this case I would say also the results were often much better, especially from the Finnish point of view. And there was a change on increasing the knowledge base for policy formation. There was a breakthrough of criminological research on hidden crime, on the adverse effects of imprisonment, on prisonization, especially in the Nordic countries, researches that showed that reoffending after imprisonment was much more common than after other sanctions, even when the groups are made, the first groups, when the groups were made identical in statistical methods. So the trust on the effectiveness of imprisonment fell radically, which also affected policies. And there was shifts following these observations and other the trends at the time. There was a growing criticism against coercive care, which was ineffective, and it also breached the legal safeguards of those sentenced to long prison terms with the pronounced aim of rehabilitation, which did not work under those conditions. So that changed the general sentencing ideology and principles. In overall, after all this and some other factors which I have to pass, there was a kind of silent agreement in Finland that our high incarceration is a kind of national disgrace, especially when we compare us with the other Nordic countries. So we decided to do something about that. To simplify that process, we can sketch some very simple question, what were the targets. We asked which groups don't belong in the prison in the first place. In Finland, the answer was obvious. Fine defaulters was one special group. Which groups are overrepresented and create the overcrowding problem in the Finnish prisons? That is, then we have to look at the volume crimes. And the answer was clear. Small property offenses and drunk drivers, they were the major groups. They were in prison and created the prison population problem. Which groups stay in the prison too long? Persistent property offenders. And which groups the prison harms the most? That is juveniles. So that was a kind of starting point. We targeted actions to all these different groups, and we conducted a series of legislative reforms, started from the late or mid-60s, continuing 20, 30 major reforms, all with the aim to regulate and reduce prison populations. There were other aims involved, of course, but the underlying rationale of the reform program was to manage prison population. So I'm just listing it so that one can see that it is not just one or two targets that was in play, but it was the whole palette in a way. Offender groups, we reduced and closed down the system of preventive detention. We restricted default prison for unpaid fines. We reduced the use of imprisonment for juveniles. As regards specific offenses, we reduced the penalty scales for theft. We reduced the penalty scales for drunk driving. On sentencing general, we reduced the impact of reoffending, recidivism, in sentencing, which is a very important element creating overlong prison sentences, especially in property offenses, where reoffending is very usual. So if you have strict reoffending rules, then you have long sentences for trivial offenses. We repelled the old recidivist rules altogether and replaced them with general sentencing rules, which laid restrictions on the, for example, on the effect of reoffending in sentencing. We increased the monetary value of day fines, and the idea was that by making fines more heavy, they can replace prison sentences, which they did. And also, if you increase the monetary value of day fines, you use fewer day fines as units, so default penalties become shorter. We expanded the application of conditional imprisonment, and we introduced community service and electronic monitoring as alternative to imprisonment. But we did that in a way that avoided net widening. We did that in a legal technical way that required the court first to sentence a prison sentence, and then that is converted to electronic monitoring or to community service. So there really came a replacement effect, not a net widening. And we restricted the use of secondary imprisonment, meaning revocations for breaching of conditions in conditional sentence or revocation on early release. It's not possible to revocate in practice these sentences just because of license breach. There must be a new criminal offense. And in practice, a new criminal offense that leads to imprisonment, then you can revoke the early. And this is very important. In some jurisdictions, there is a substantial number of prisoners just for revocation reasons for license breaches. And then as regards enforcement, we expanded early release program, and we expanded open prison enforcement, use of open prisons. So now this gives the picture that this is an overarching program, and not just one, and it touched all basic elements. So now here are just some historical examples. This shows the decline of fine defaulters in Finland in prison in the 60s. And this shows the decline of preventive detention, which were usually property offenders, how that was restricted. And this shows the share of prisoners. These are all prisoners, the line that are released from prison. This is the share of the prisoners that are released on parole, meaning early release, conditional release. We don't have actual parole. Point here is that from late 80s, all prisoners are released, are in early release program, with a very, very few prisoners who serve their whole sentence. So now, if we then look how then we have been able to maintain that lower level of imprisonment. It's basically the same list that I just went through. The prison sentences are short. We use fines. That's the most used in penalty, also in middle rank offenses. We use extensively conditional imprisonment. 2 out of 3 prison sentences are imposed conditionally. The community service especially is a very effective alternative to imprisonment. And there is this automatic release, early release program. There is much less secondary imprisonment only because of new offense. And there is the sentencing rules oblige the courts to use imprisonment as a last resort. Youth justice operates only mainly in child welfare for offenders below 15 only in child welfare system. From 15 to 17, in practice, the child welfare system is the most important. And then there's wider use of open prisons. So we could then also, this was a technical way of looking at things, which are the technical means that we could look the more macro or meso-level factors which make it possible to conduct this kind of moderate penal policies. They would go to the same type of factors that initiated the reform, but we could say that strengthening universalistic welfare state, that went on till the early 90s. Then came the hard times in economy. We had for long negotiating political culture, coalition governments, which are based on cooperation between different parties instead of conflict and contradictions, which has meant that the crime has stayed largely out of the political agenda. It's not a political issue in general politics. There are bureaucratic administrative structures supporting expert-driven, long-term, consistent policy planning. The criminal law reform committee sat from early 80s to late 90s, 20 years, and it was politically shielded from changing ministers, so they had a lot of independence in drafting that. That's a good example, the penal code. And there were strong informal networks covering essential actors in penal field, research, law drafting, enforcement, and courts. This working of this, they were no longer these social activist groups which initiated the reforms in the 60s, but often the same people. Now they had grown older, and perhaps a little wiser, and they were working in these key offices. So that kind of cooperation may also be important. And we had reasonable media. Quality media is a market leader in Finland, less so in other Nordic countries, but the difference to United States or England and Wales is very clear. And what is important in individual law reforms is that there was well-planned reform implementation. Every time when there was a major criminal law reform, there was training for the judges and for the prosecutors about this reform and its aims. So it was a way to make sure that the reform is accepted and implemented as was the idea. And at that time, till late 90s, practically all criminal law reforms pointed at more lenient direction. They were all about reducing control and reducing the use of imprisonment. Since then, things have changed, and I'll come back to that later. But now this was the structure and what was behind the decline of imprisonment, prison rates. Now I will skip. Now these are the details of the present system. I'm not going to talk about that. This is also a decline of the youth imprisonment of juveniles in prison. These are absolute numbers, and this is percentage. No, this is absolute numbers. No, percentage absolute numbers. But the main point is there's a radical decline in the use of imprisonment in juveniles. Now it's a very rare occasion. We also can, and also the expansion of mediation is relevant in not perhaps so much as a direct alternative to imprisonment, but as a form new imagination and what can be done instead of criminal justice, criminal process. We have over 10,000 mediation cases in Finland. To put that in perspective, we have 5,000 imposed prison sentences. So this is really a massive practice. And the prison system, what I would take here is the wide use of open prisons and the principle of normalcy. Try to arrange the prison conditions in a manner that resembles the conditions in the outside world. That is the leading enforcement principle in the Nordic country. And one of the key ways of doing that is to use open enforcement, open prisons. This is interesting point, detail in enforcement system. I have not seen much comparative work examining how often the open prisons are used. I tried to collect that data and include there also semi-detention, which is in some European countries. And what I've then finally got is this is the share of those countries of which I got the information. This is the share of open prisoners, of prisoners in open prison of all prisoners, which shows that in Finland a little over 30% of prisoners are in open enforcement. Then comes from Norway, Denmark, Iceland, and then Germany, Switzerland, and Sweden on the same category. And now, if I'm right, open prison is very rare concept in France. It looks like we are talking about 2% of prisoners or something like that. Now, I don't know whether there is something compensatory, similar arrangement, but if not, that is one detail on the prison system which is worthwhile to reconsider. Because the benefits of open prison are clear. There's less prisonization, lower cost, better prospects for social rehabilitation, more meaningful work, more relaxed atmosphere. There is now a lot of research showing that there are much better inmate-staff relations, and which are all factors that reduce the harmful prisonization effects, and also our way towards a better rehabilitation. So that was just some element on the present system. I think now in the end I should look at the relation crime and punishment. That was already touched by Jose Brandaric, and I take some complementary points on that. Now, this is a very complex connection because you can either look from crime to imprisonment, or you can look from crime effects to imprisonment, that's clear, and prison effects to crime, that's clear. So there's two ways which are probably impossible to separate. But still, there are certain ways that one can approach it. Of course, when it comes to imprisonment crime, there are preventive effects and criminogenic effects. We are mostly interested on the preventive effects, but we should also look on the criminogenic effects. Then there is from crime to imprisonment, and this is the question that has been now discussed more. How much does crime influence in the use of imprisonment, and how much? I think there's one analytical distinction that needs to be made here, which has not been observed well enough. There are differences. There are, in a way, two ways crime can influence imprisonment. One is just through volume, by numbers. More crime, more arrests, more convictions, more prisoners. This is by just mechanical number-based effect. And then there's the effect crime can have on policies. We can call it policy effect, meaning, and they are not dependent on the same factors. Even a few very dramatic offenses or increase in a very serious offense, which is in numeric terms irrelevant, may have large policy effects and be influenced. So now some sort of disagreement on the issue whether crime affects imprisonment or not is a result of that we don't make we can't differentiate between these two effects. We should be able to study them both, which is not very easy. So what I can do now is just to again show some statistical comparisons. And the one was the Nordic experience. The fact that Finland dropped its prisoner rates from a level of 160 or from 80 to 60, which is the same level that the other Nordic countries was. And from there on, Finland stayed on the same level. Throughout this whole period, the other Nordic countries kept their rates relatively stable. So Finland was the deviating one, coming up to the Nordic level. The others stayed flat. So the question is now, how did this radical difference in profile, how was that reflected in crime rates? Meaning still that Finland dropped its imprisonment rate into 1/3 of the original position. And we can look at this. Now here you see this, what I was talking about. This is Finland coming from there. These are other Nordic countries in their incarceration rates. And when we look at recorded crime in these same countries, we see it like this. They all go up, which is a result of the fact that on the 60s, crime in Western, still in the 70s and 80s, crime in Western countries was going up. But the point here is that they go up in a similar fashion, like tied in hand, in an identical manner, despite the fact that we had totally different prison policy. So this is one argument saying, which could be pointing at that direction, that it was possible to reduce the use of imprisonment drastically without disturbing the symmetry of trends in crime, which shows that there are other factors which are much more relevant for the development of crime, which also implies that by tinkering with the prison system, you really don't make much changes in your crime situation. You should look at other issues. So that is the kind of general. Of course, it does not mean that this is totally irrelevant. Of course, it isn't. Imprisonment has some effect, but it may have also this criminogenic effect. So we are not quite sure which is more powerful. But anyway, that was one of the lessons. Now we can add on this comparison another country, saying, okay, this was so specific, Nordic countries are so curious and strange. But here is now Finland. I added the 3 other Nordic countries because they were following the same line together. So this is United, Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, the red line. And here is England and Wales on their imprisonment rates. And now you see how crime rates now in these countries go, recorded crime. Again, they go exactly the same way. Irrespective of the fact that you have one going down, one staying flat, one going up, they all go up in the same manner. So this is rather, it's not conclusive, but it's a rather strong suggestion toward that direction that they are, in this case, fairly independent, or at least crime is affected by other factors. What about United States and Canada? Making similar comparisons with United States. Now, this is United States imprisonment rate here. And this is United States homicide, all violent crime, property crime. This is the same in Canada. Canada imprisonment rate, now you can see there's a huge difference. Canada stays flat, US goes up. What is interesting is that the crime rates in these countries, they are very, very alike. Despite the fact that, again, the incarceration rates were totally different. So, it does not seem, well, if we try to explain the US imprisonment rate by crime, then we have to answer the question why imprisonment rate started to increase 15 years later when crime started to increase. Of course, we can try to do that and say, well, this is a policy reaction which just took 15 years to be realized. But then there are countries which had the immediate policy reaction. So anyway, this shows a bit the problems that we have in trying to explain imprisonment rate just with reference to crime. It doesn't say that crime is irrelevant. In average, crime is relevant when it comes to convicted offenses. And therefore, now approaching the last previous speakers, some of the conclusions there. Therefore, it is when we look at the most recent overall changes in incarceration, which are going down in Western Europe from 2010. That is the figures from previous research. We cannot overlook the violent crime rates and the property crime rates, which shows a very, this is now major European countries, violent crime and property crime. The red one is United States, and show that there is a global crime drop in recorded crime from those in violent crime. It took later, in property crimes earlier. So it just means that, again, the warnings do not interpret the fact that we are having declining incarceration rate as a sign that now things are getting better. You should then relate these to developments of crime. So here is a little working on this. This is Nordic countries, recorded crime, different recorded crime, and the thick blue line is imprisonment rate. Now set to value in 2008 to value 100. So this shows the relative changes. You see declining incarceration rates overall, but you see even much more declining imprisonment rates. Which indicates that basically against every new crime there is more and more prisoners, which indicates that we are in fact still increasing in the middle of increased use of, relatively increased use of imprisonment. And why is that? We should then look more general factors in a society which deal with income distribution, political tensions, political radicalization, weakening welfare state, weakening social trust, all elements which are relevant in a more general analysis. We don't have the time for that. I'm just showing you one figure which is rather telling in this respect. This is the income distribution, fairness of income distribution measured by Gini, which is how equally income is distributed among population. Well, the larger the Gini figure is, the more uneven, more unfair income distribution and social equality is. And the smaller one, the fairer the society is in this respect. Now in Anglophone countries, you can see they go hand in hand. As income distribution comes unfairer and the social distances become greater, so does imprisonment grow together. Now, this is one of the conclusions asserted also in Vacant's analysis and several others. It just points at the direction which we look. There are other factors which I think I just have to pass here, but just mention them. It's a political economy. And this is where I started from what was behind the decline, reduction of prison use in Finland is the consensual corporatist democracy with multi-party coalition governments, which were one way of building the Nordic welfare state, which when you have a strong welfare state with well, social security, social equality, solidarity, shared responsibility, you have higher social trust, you have higher political legitimacy, and these are conducive to a more tolerant, consistent penal policy. With a reasonable media, which we had at that time, and judicial cultures with career judicial officers, then you have possibilities for inclusive welfare policy. If the penal policy, and if something happens here and you have the other option, conflict politics, bipolarized political system, a lot of crisis thought, weak welfare state, social inequality, insecurity, social distrust, then crime will have. The societies will respond to crime in a punitive manner. Then you will have these policy effects on your penal system in case with increased crime. In the other case, that was not the case. Finland was able to reduce prison population even if there was a radical increase in crime in those days, because it was shielded by these protective factors in society. Now things are changing. Now, if we are now facing the fact that we are still, relatively speaking, we are using more prisoners because crime is going very much down, we still have high prisoner rate. It is because we are living more in these surroundings now. And that is visible also in the Nordic countries. We have right-wing governments now which have made it very polarized, the political discussion. There is no consensus seeking whatsoever, for example, at the moment in a Finnish government. That may end up, but anyway, it shows that how the increased tensions in political field is very quickly reflected into welfare cuts, which is now taking place, declining trust in the government at the moment. And that will all have effects on penal policies and social welfare policies, of which penal policies very often are just one part of a point that I should have made much earlier. So I think this is a good picture to close down this. Oh, there's something did happen. Yeah, and there was some sources. So thank you very much for listening.